Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. So we're happy to welcome you all. We know that it may be different timing at the country from where you are you are attending, but we're so happy that you are all here with us in our webinar. Our webinar today is entitled Supporting Pharmacy Leaders and Educators for Implementing Competency-Based Education in Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences Education. So today, we are happy to launch with you the FIP CBE Implementation Handbook. So, in today's event, we are having the pleasure to have with us some of the authors of this handbook that will be here in order to present why this handbook was there or is there and what are the different chapters in this handbook that will help you implement CBE or competency-based education in your pharmacy education, be it pharmacy or pharmaceutical sciences. Today, me and my colleague, Dalia Bajis, will be co-moderating this event. I am Marwan Ael, and I am FIP Project Manager for Workforce Development, Evidence and Impact. And we have Dalia Bajis, who is the FIP Lead for Project Provision and Partnership. Together, both of us will be moderating this event. So, let's start with some housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded and is live streamed via YouTube. The recording will be available on our website at www.events.fip.org. You may ask questions using the question box provided. So please, whenever you have any question during this webinar, go to the Q&A box and just write down your questions. We will make sure to answer those questions, be it live during the panel discussion at the end of this webinar, or some of the of our authors that are presenters will be also answering you directly on the Q&A box. You are welcome to provide feedback at webinars@fip.org. And if you're still not an FIP member and you want to join us, please go to our website to fip.org and go to membership registration and become an FIP member. Allow me now to give the floor to my colleague, Dalia Bajis, in order to present us the objectives of our webinar.
Thank you so much, Marwan, and welcome to our attendees on the call, but also welcome to the speakers who have enlightened this particular event with their expertise and knowledge, and also who have been involved in the development of such a useful resource for all of our pharmacy educators and academics in their profession. It's a pleasure to be joining you all today, particularly that I was involved as an author, but also as a team player in the production of this publication. So, delve straight into it. The objectives of today's webinar are to allow you to understand the importance of competency-based education in pharmacy and pharmaceutical education, to allow you to also describe the structure of the FIPEd Competency-based Education Implementation Handbook, and finally to identify how the handbook can support yourself in your academic institution on your journeys to implement CBE at your institutions. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our colleague and project lead for the development of this handbook, Dr. Nako Arakawa. Dr. Nako Arakawa is known to many of you, but he's the assistant professor in international pharmacy at the University of Nottingham in the UK. At FIP, he is the global lead for competency development, DV5, in the FIP Hub. She's also the secretary of the FIP Academic Pharmacy section, and she is, as I said earlier, the project lead for the FIP CBE Implementation Handbook project. Welcome, Nako. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you as our first speaker and the lead for this project. Congratulations in advance.
Thank you very much for kind introduction, Daria, and thank you for the great start of the webinar, Marwan. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. So I'm now Karakawa, Assistant Professor at University of Nottingham, UK, and had the privilege to lead this special international team in the FIP for developing this FIP CBE Implementation Handbook. So in my talk, I will go through why CBE and why we need this handbook, and then launch of this great handbook, I will say, and how it was developed. And lastly, the structure of the handbook so that following speakers can go through each chapter. So why competency-based education, CBE? So health is a fundamental human right. This was stated by WHO Director General in 2017 to commemorate Human Rights Day. And this is a core concept of universal health coverage. So would you please click, that would be great, thank you. So to achieve universal health coverage, we need sufficient human resources for health, including the pharmaceutical workforce, of course, with right competencies to meet the health system's demands and the health needs of population. I believe we all agree this universal truth, which was already reported as WHO report, but saying no health without the workforce. So please, next slide. So with this background, WHO recommended that we need to scale up and strengthen quality transformative education based on the health needs and demands of the populations and health systems. To support this vision, adopting a competency-based education CBE approach was called for globally as an instructional design of health professions in education. Can you go through that one click as well? Thank you. And the next slide, please. Yes, so with this global call, actually aligned perfectly with the FIP vision for pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences education. In the FIP needs-based education model, which has been advocated for more than 10 years, CBE is at the core of this cyclic model. Having this vision, FIP created the development goal 5 competency developments. I'm honored to be one of the global leads for the DC5 with the other wonderful leads. And to support pharmacy leaders and educators, some competency frameworks were already developed in the FIP, which you can find and download from the FIP website for free, which I absolutely recommend. So please go to the next slide. Thank you. So while supporting pharmacy leaders and educators developing and adopting the CBE approach in their pharmacy education, I heard a lot of their challenges related to their CBE implementation, especially in the pre-registration education and training, which we called as initial education. So these challenges are, so many got confused with other educational theories. This is easily understandable because the CBE approach consists of the combinations of educational theories and notions in contemporary higher education settings. And the less flexible training pathways in the higher education settings are not helpful either. So this is because the initial pharmacy and pharmaceutical education training is often determined by regulation and legislation surrounding pharmacist registration in the country. And higher education programs are normally time defined by the university system. And differences from traditional education and the adoption and the implementation of new approach require extra effort, but often resources are limited. This includes funding for it, but also human resources like academic staff. So these comments and the experiences of pharmacy leaders and educators motivated us some members from academic pharmacy section and the FIP education team to develop the FIP Competency-based Education Implementation Handbook. So please go to the next slide. So now I am very happy to announce a launch of the FIP CBE Implementation Handbook, which is formally called Competency-based Education in Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, a FIP handbook to support implementation of competency-based education and training. So this handbook is now available at the FIP website. If you are excited enough to download them right now, you can go to the website from this QR code or web link on the slide. So you can keep the handbook with you while we go through the different parts of the handbook in this webinar. So can I go to the next, please? Thank you. So this handbook was developed by the team on the slide. Their expertise, dedication, and teamwork made this handbook possible. I was truly, truly fortunate to lead this fantastic team. Thank you all. So could you go to the next slide? So the handbook has 6 chapters, and the glossary and appendix are provided at the end. So considering the journey of the CBE implementation, you often think and then going through recognizing the CBE model and understanding the current situation of CBE, but also preparing yourself and the team for organizing the CBE implementation. Then you have to design the curriculum concepts and feedback and assessment for that, but also you have to design the evaluation process of the implementation. Then you have to delivery of the CBE, but also you have to prepare the faculty development to deliver the CBE program. And then you have to evaluate the implementation. So all of these stages are supported by many other chapters in the FIP. So you can use this handbook in any place of your journey. So we developed this handbook based on the evidence, including the new systematic review and the global survey on the CBE used in pharmacy and pharmaceutical education, which you will hear the summary of them later. So this handbook is developed to be a practical, step-by-step guide and a reference for readers to review when you encounter any challenges during your CBE implementation. So can I move to the next? Thank you. So due to the challenges and experiences that I mentioned in previous slide, we developed this handbook considering the initial pharmacy and pharmaceutical education and training setting. You can see on the slide, the left-hand side of this diagram. So this is a higher education program that leads graduates to a formal registration as a pharmacist with a statutory body of the country where the education is provided. And this can be considered as pre-registration education and training in higher education setting. However, some examples and educational formats and assessment styles described in the handbook can also be used to support the implementation of CBE concepts in continuing professional development CPD and postgraduate programs and other lifelong learning settings too. So now I sincerely hope this handbook will inspire pharmacy education leaders, educators, and trainers like you, and to implement the CBE in your programs and support your journey of the CBE implementation. Thank you very much. Moa and Dalia, I will give you a floor back.
Thank you, Naoko. And as you said, we're so excited and happy to be sharing what was worked on in this handbook. And as you said, they will find everything they want about competency-based education, from implementation to evaluation. Now we will go to our next speaker, and allow me to welcome Jessica Macmillan. Jessica is a UK pharmacist, and she's a PhD student at the University of Nottingham. Jessica will be talking about the global status of CBE in pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences education. Jessica, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you, Marwan, and welcome everybody. I'm going to talk about chapter 3 in the handbook, and this is research that was done with the University of Nottingham and Naoko Arakawa and Claire Anderson, who also contributed to this chapter. So if we go to the next slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about why we did the research. So it was basically to collect the information about what CBE looks like at the moment globally. And the reason for doing that is to understand a little bit more what the needs are, the challenges, the enablers, the ways CBE is being used, and all of that we can look at to guide where we need to focus further development. And as Nalco mentioned, we did that via a systematic review. And the main aim of that was to identify common features of CBE, and then also a global survey, which was distributed to pharmacy schools all around the globe to see how they're using CBE and also specifically ask about challenges. So next slide, please. So systematic review can be accessed. It is published. You can get that from the Research in Social and Administrative Pharmacy Journal by scanning the code on the screen now. So I won't cover that one too much because we can access all the full details, but I will talk about that a little bit later. The global survey, again, as I said, it was distributed online globally. We used the contact details that were already available from FIP and from the European Association of Faculties of Pharmacy. So big thanks to both of them for helping with distribution, which was the end of last year, the beginning of this year. The survey went out to pharmacy schools, pharmaceutical science institutions, and we asked respondents to work together as a team or to nominate the best suitable person to reply who's going to know about CBE basically, or know about how the course or the module or the program is structured. And there was demographical information gathered as well as specific information about CBE and their approach. Next slide, please. So on the screen at the moment is the summary of the features from the systematic review. So there was 20 features. They were categorized into 6 overarching themes, which you can just see on the left there. And these basically were coming out as the main areas of research in the studies that were included. So we included studies from the last decade, basically. So it was as up to date as possible and really helped to focus in on the latest developments. As well as the main features, which are CBE specific, there was associated features or sub-features. There's 21 of those, and these were commonly referred to in the studies, but they're not necessarily essential components of CBE, but they do come up again and again and again, and there will be important parts of anybody who's looking at implementing CBE. So you can just see here the categories that kept coming up. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive list because it's just of the studies that were included. But in the chapter in the handbook, these features are covered in a little bit more detail, where we highlight the key findings in terms of what might be useful when considering CBE implementation and development in relation to these features. They were gathered from a total of 28 studies. These studies were distributed throughout different locations, but there was no study representation from Africa or Southeast Asia, which suggests CBE activity there is probably low. There was one study included that covered more than one region as well. Most of the studies were based on undergraduate education, and then the second most common was post-qualification training, and then finally postgraduate education. And in the review, we covered all types of education and training, and we covered research that was for part of programs, whole programs, just covered anything really that was connected to the essential kind of concept of CBE, which is about having an outcome-based learning rather than a time-based learning system. So the next slide, please. So in terms of the survey, I'll just move on to that now and just give you a quick summary of what the main features of the kind of respondents were from the survey. So there were 72 in total. 62 were using CBE, 10 were not. Of those 10 that weren't using CBE, they were from a number of different places: Australia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Japan, Malaysia, Pakistan, Nigeria, and the US. Of 6 of those 10 did indicate that they were planning on using CBE within the next 5 years. And for both pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences, the majority of the programs that were referred to by the participants were using a whole CBE program. But we also included people that were using a part program. So the same as the systematic review. So the systematic review helped to identify some of the key areas which we directed the questions, but also we did decide to include any CBE related activity, not just pure whole, specifically CBE designed curriculums. So on the next slide, I'll just show you some of the main results. Again, there's some more in the chapter in the handbook, but this one specifically related to resources, because we're all interested in resources, I think, when it comes to implementing a new initiative. And for resources, staff, funding, classrooms, nothing unusual in terms of any kind of educational development. Some of the specific CBE elements that were addressed, as well as resources, include health needs assessment. So the most common challenge for health needs assessment was inadequate faculty training or skills. For curriculum design, the most common challenge was difficulty with obtaining stakeholder engagement. For systems of instruction and learning methods, the most difficult area for people was interprofessional education. And for feedback and assessment, the most challenging area was workplace and experiential learning. And then I think the only area which had no challenge encountered as the main response was in selecting competencies and drafting competency frameworks, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, there wasn't any studies from Africa or Asia in the systematic review. There was also only a few respondents from those areas in the global survey. On top of that, there is a big chance of response bias with the survey, because if you don't have CBE or you don't know about CBE, you're not likely to respond. So we have probably got a slight underrepresentation of the non-CBE institutions that are out there. Also, I think, as Nauka alluded to in her slides, there is still some discrepancy or heterogeneity with the definitions, terminology, interpretations of CBE, understanding what it really is. So bearing in mind that there is going to be some differences across different places with that when interpreting the results, just needs bearing in mind. And then, as I said before, competencies and frameworks seems to be a strong area in CBE development. This could be good. This could be due to the fact there are a lot of frameworks out there now. A lot of countries have made their own, and we do have the global competency framework from the FIP. We do still need to do improvement with interprofessional education and also in experiential. These are two areas that people commonly struggle with. Also, faculty support is quite common, because the survey and the systematic review both gathered data where we need to be able to support the faculty, the whole faculty in a number of different areas to actually make the change meaningful and to have effective CBE. CBE also depends on the context, and situations do differ. So regulatory, political, socio-economic, pharmacy practice kind of priorities, things like that do need to be taken into account. So in summary and implementation, the evidence is strong for external and internal factors to be taken into account, both within the institutions and much wider. So stakeholder engagement, careful consideration and getting all the right people on board will really help to push any implementation to be much more effective. And finally, on the last slide, I'll just mention again this evidence that we found is useful for those that are considering implementing or improving their current CBE. There are a lot of advancements that are happening at the moment. There is a lot of evidence out there, a lot of useful kind of examples of successful CBE, but they are not uniformly distributed. And it is hard to get information on those countries where we found that there was evidence lacking, and that's Africa and Southeast Asia. So really, my hope is that we get to do some more research in those areas and that we can further support these contexts which have diverse needs and limited resources. And this handbook is a good start to do that, and we would hope to eventually build on more areas as well around the globe to help with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jess, for providing us with this overview from your research findings on CBE and the extent of CBE in the literature. Really insightful. We will move now, you're very welcome. We'll move now to our next presenter, Dr. Andres Costa, who is an Associate Professor of Pharmacology at Utrecht University at the Netherlands. He's a member of the Executive Committee of the European Association of Faculties of Pharmacy, EAFP. Now, Andres has been pivotal in the development of the handbook, and he has been involved in the design, implementation, and organization of curricula in this particular area of pharmacy and pharmaceutical education for over 20 years. Andres, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the floor, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Dalia, for the introduction, and hello to everybody worldwide, wherever you are, from the Netherlands in this case. I also included in the first slide, I think, the faculty I've been working for a long time, because I think it was very helpful in developing programs, getting experiences, etc. So in the next slide, there's a highlight of how the chapter, which is, I think, I should say, quite a complicated chapter, is organized, and I will only highlight some aspects of that in this presentation. Of course, first of all, it's preparation, like finding a suitable framework, which could be from FIP or otherwise, and how to organize whatever you want to do in implementing CBE. I will not pay too much attention to that at the moment. Then, of course, an important aspect is the design of a curriculum as a whole, and on a somewhat deeper level, the design of individual courses within that curriculum. And in the end, I will pay some attention to setting priorities. If you want to start on it, but you have not the means or the resources to do a full implementation, what can you do to start with? So first of all, to the first subject, the preparation and the get organized. Can I have the next slide? Yes. you will see that it's usually a very complicated situation. It's not only a competency framework which you need, but you also have to deal with the university structure, which sometimes can be very restrictive. For example, you have some kind of expectations from your stakeholders, from your wider environment, and there may be national laws and regulations. And in that complicated combination of all kinds of possible restrictions, but also challenges, of course, it's as a faculty or as a school, you have to find ways of changing either an existing curriculum into a competency-based education or start all over again, which of course is very rare to do. And in that case, most of the old elements of a curriculum can be used in a new curriculum. And in this chapter is more or less written as if a completely new curriculum could be developed, but of course you will find details which can be used in making smaller changes. So in the next slide, I illustrate what I always find the most puzzling process. You can organize it, and I think two things are very important: that you have you need a two-tiered organization, mainly one concerned with the curriculum as a whole, and the other, of course, on the level of individual courses or other elements of a curriculum. And that, for me, is always a very magic process, because it very much depends on the people involved. And I more or less suggested it to call it a magic potion model, but of course, it's not a strict model in the sense that we can easily describe it, because it so much depends on individuals. What mix do you have of people? Who are they? What time can they spend on a curriculum? And what is their their motivation? I sometimes say motivation is everything in designing a curriculum, but also, of course, in the implementation and in the organization later on. So let's move on to the actual design of a curriculum. So the level of the curriculum committee. And as most of you will know, is of course that the competency-based curriculum is based on learning principles, which we usually call social constructivist principles, which set the learning of students central. It's about the learning of the students. It's not about the teaching. So everything you have to do in your teaching needs to reflect your thinking about how can this help my students to learn what they need to learn. And the way of constructing a curriculum is in essence layered. It's sometimes called a spiral curriculum, but the essence of that is that all the subjects are already initiated at the beginning of a curriculum. And already at the beginning of the curriculum, the students need to get a picture about what the actual role of a pharmacist will be by the time they finish their studies. And that's extremely important for maintaining their motivation during the whole program. And sometimes it means that, for example, certain chemical subjects are not treated in the beginning of a curriculum, but can be shifted to later parts of the curriculum whenever the needs for learning those particular details becomes visible for the student. And it's also the curriculum. The other thing the curriculum is doing is that they try to change the orientation of a student who comes usually from secondary school or a previous bachelor program, from a discipline focus of learning to a practice-orientated orientation during their studies. And that needs what I call an orchestration of the courses and the particular sequence of the courses, etc. So that's summarized in one slide. Of course, in the handbook, it will give a lot of references and referrals to literature where you can find further details. An important aspect of the curriculum, of course, is the layering of the curriculum, which is illustrated in the next slide, where It's just maybe you cannot read it all in detail, but the picture, of course, is in the handbook. But it's also only about emphasizing that you need a lot of thinking in designing a curriculum. It's layered. It will start at relatively simple level, and then becoming more and more complex, more and more integrated as the curriculum progresses. And authentic assessments are extremely important in that respect, because they mimic the aspects of future professional life. And also a relatively new development is the use of entrustable professional activities. And I should say that many of those ideas of curriculum development for competency-based pharmacy education, of course, come from the medical field. And I should say that I'm very strongly influenced also by the person who designed or invented the entrustable professional activities, who was a professor of medical education in our university, who was just opposite our pharmacy building. So I learned a lot from him. So these two slides just summarize the whole curriculum. And of course, there are many other things and many strands and longitudinal aspects to take into account, but you will find the details in the chapter 4. I will spend one slide on the next level of detailing individual courses, which is just illustrated here as something which is produced by the curriculum committee, which I call a course specification, a description of, let's say, the limitations, but also the possibilities and suggestions for implementation of individual courses, which must come from the curriculum committee as a kind of framework for the course development. And just to illustrate that, you will see a fully developed course illustrated in the right half of this picture. It's just an example. You will find more examples in the literature, also in the handbook, etc. And this is a kind of process in a course development team, which sometimes follow the same lines as the overall curriculum design in the curriculum committee, but on a more detailed level and a more practical level. And also in this case, it's important to be aware of all kinds of education material you may have available from an existing curriculum or from the literature, etc., which could be reused in a new curriculum. So this slide more or less illustrates the principle of how to be practical in course development. Of course, not everybody can do it in the way we did. About 20 years ago, we started with a whole new curriculum from scratch. And it took us 3 to 5 years to be more or less satisfied with the original design. And of course, you need evaluations, re-evaluations, reconsidering some aspects, etc., as will be also taught later in the next presentation. But I have a final slide, which gives more or less an idea about what could be done if you are not able to do it as a full-flung development during a 3 or 5 year, because you have limited resources, etc. That's also described in this chapter in the final part. And you could start, for example, with what I call introducing elements of CBE into earlier parts of the curriculum without disrupting the overall curriculum structure. And that you need to apply some principles of social constructivist learning, which, by the way, are also referred to in the chapter itself. But of course, there's a lot of other literature from particularly from the higher education development literature. Then the next, a little bit more complicated subject might be to integrate disciplinary content and skills in individual courses. And that, of course, you can do that on a relatively small scale, starting with individual courses or a number of courses, or starting from the final year and then move backwards to earlier years of the curriculum. And the next step will be, let's say, to go a step further in reorganizing the the course sequencing, the set milestones, so milestones which need to be passed by students because they can move on to the next stage in the curriculum, etc. And that means structuring on a level which is above the level of an individual course. And also, I should say, sometimes at this stage, you also need to reconsider the whole organization of a department or a school or an institution. And final stage could be considered of a curriculum development if you can introduce entrustable professional activities in earlier parts of the program, not only in postgraduate programs, for example, but that needs to, you need quite a lot of experience already with the other parts. I think this more or less concludes my my presentation as a short summary of chapter 4, which again is also, I think it's rather up to date with all the available literature in that area, and I hope it can be very helpful for people everywhere in the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Andres, for the wonderful presentation. And as you said, we can all find details on what you have been presenting in the handbook itself. We go now to another chapter of the handbook with other authors, and Pierre Moreau is one of the authors of this chapter. We have the pleasure to have Dr. Pierre with us today to be talking about evaluation of CBE implementation. Dr. Pierre is a professor at the Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics at the College of Pharmacy in Kuwait University. He is also a member of the academic institution members. He's the chair of the AIM at the International Pharmaceutical Federation. Pierre has been involved in the development of competency-based education curricula in different colleges of pharmacy around the globe. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Marwan. You hear me well? Okay, good. All right. So welcome, everyone. Glad you were able to join today to talk about this aspect of competency-based education. Of course, whatever curriculum we want to introduce, we always have to evaluate, make sure we improve it as we go, and we will look into that. And this is what was the main goal of this chapter that I had the chance to work on with colleagues from Qatar, where the World Cup is happening. So Banan Mukhalalaiti is one of the author. Abir Al-Khananim as well from USA, and Abi Kahalek from USA. We were working together to write this chapter, and we had contributions from some accreditation bodies, Mike Rouse in the US and Wayne Hindmarsh from Canada as well. So basically, if we go to the next slide, as you know, it's important for quality of education to be paramount in pharmacy and pharmaceutical sciences. In my book, quality education will lead to quality of care and quality of research as well. So we have it's the foundation, and we have to make sure that the foundation is solid. And the way we addressed this quality assurance system in this chapter, we will talk about two dimensions. One is the day-to-day or the continuous quality improvements, CQI. And the second one would be more the periodical comprehensive evaluation, like would be done, for instance, during an accreditation cycle. So these two are, you know, intertwined, important, but they have different, let's say, workflows that we will discuss in this chapter. As you may know, FIP has been providing tools for a number of years about quality assurance, and it's part of their FIP Development Goals. So it's also always something that we have to keep in mind to do quality work as pharmacists, but also that the education is of quality. So basically, we will try to always underline the impact or the aspect of CBE, so competency-based education, within the quality assurance framework. So on the next slide, we will start with the first aspect, which is CQI, continuous quality improvement. And before you start doing that, you have to ask yourself a couple of questions, setting goals, like what is the purpose of gathering data to get information about the quality of what I'm doing? What are the desired educational outcomes? So are we reaching that? So you have first to know what are your goals, where are the goalposts? Then you have to set expectations. What are the specific answers you want, specific questions you want to answer, and how you will know that you are meeting the educational outcomes. So again, what are the goals or the that you are setting for yourself, so that you know which metric to look at and what are the numbers you want to reach. And finally, who will be involved in collecting this data? You may have to communicate your strategy, your quality assurance strategy with other people, with external stakeholders, preceptors, and others. And of course, what is the strategy that you will take to make changes when you collect data that suggests that things are not going smoothly and you need to make some changes? So all these things you have to think beforehand. On the next slide, it's a schematic kind of trying to summarize this CQI framework. So basically, the first step is to gather data by using different types of tools. It could be surveys, could be focus groups, it could be interviews that will give you the information that you need. So this is very important. And then, of course, it should ideally not be done once, but follow like a schedule that yearly every course is evaluated, and every the preceptors and the employers are also questioned regularly, so that you can put year after year, semester after semester, month after month, so that you can make the changes that are required. Then once you get the data, you need to analyze it. Normally, it's easy when you have a specific committee, like a quality assurance unit or committee, could be the curriculum committee as well, that will look at this data and that will make some critical decisions and make recommendations for improvement. Then, of course, these recommendations will have to be communicated with the appropriate people, either in a department, either to a course coordinator, to preceptors. So whatever the changes that need to be made has to be communicated with the person that will be able to make this change. And then these will have to implement the changes and maybe get support from you to make sure that they can do it. They may need specific training and specific support from other colleagues to do that. And then, of course, the cycle goes again, and the future data gathering will tell you if you reached the goals that you set or not. So this is, of course, a high-level overview of what you will find in detail in the chapter. So if we move on to the next slide, this is an example, for instance, of how this process can be organized. So, for instance, you would get a survey for student satisfaction. In this case, the stakeholders are the students. The data, the indicators will be provided to a quality assurance unit that will have to make data analysis and make recommendations either at the course level or either at the program level. So it could feed back to a curriculum committee if it involves changing, for instance, the sequence of courses, or it can go to a specific course if there was an issue in one course that needs to be resolved. And if we think about, on the next slide, competency-based education, for instance, previous slide, please. It looks similar, but so there could be, for instance, a competency portfolio that could feed into a competency review committee. This is a CRC. Will look at the data and will feed that to the quality assurance so that the right decisions can be made again. So this is an example of how to implement CQI, or continuous quality improvement, as a workflow, something that's done on a regular basis, something that's done all the time. Next slide, please. So this is the things that needs to be done, especially at the introduction of a new curriculum. There's a lot of things to look at and make sure that, the communication with the students is flowing, so that definitely there could be, some improvements. The second part is more talking about this periodical comprehensive evaluation. And this could be because you need to be accredited, for instance, but there could be other sources of need to fulfill. And normally there will be two steps to any of these comprehensive evaluations: a self-study report, where you will investigate yourself and see how you fare compared to some explicit standards. And then, of course, a site visit that will validate your self-study report or your self-assessment, your strengths and weaknesses, to make sure that what you wrote is actually accurate. And this is normally the process is done this way. Of course, it's always seen as something tedious and difficult, but it's really, I think, a source of inspiration to push initiatives like competency-based education forward, because it provides, again, a means of being relevant and continuing to be accountable to the society where you are based. On the next slide, we also have like a schematic of this self-study report, where you gather evidence that you are, addressing the standards that are expected to be fulfilled. You have to demonstrate how this evidence you're providing is relevant to the standard. You also, and that's very important, reflect on areas where you could improve, because we're not perfect, and it's very important to be transparent and be honest about your evaluation, that not everything is perfect, that there are things that you can improve. And then, of course, you can as well, you have to work also on the quality of the report, because it gives a window on how you do things and how meticulous you are. So if your report is well done, it also suggests that the rest of the things in the faculty are well done as well. So I'll quickly move to the next slide because my time is up. Basically, when we think about these periodical comprehensive evaluation, like a site visit for accreditation, and the program that we have is a competency-based education program, and there is a national competency framework, then it's very easy to demonstrate that the competencies are developed, because that's actually the objective of the whole curriculum. We talked about EPA. This will also the assessment of these professional activities will also kind of satisfy a lot of the standards and will make your life easy. Of course, if you have a non-competency-based education program in a national during accreditation, and there is a national competency framework, then you will have to demonstrate that by not focusing on competencies, you're still developing competent pharmacists. So you will have to kind of try to link your learning objectives to competency development, to link knowledge acquisition to knowledge application, which is not always easy to do, and you will have to provide this map. So it's much more complicated to comply with a competency framework at the national level that is used for accreditation purposes when you have a non-CBE program. So it could be an advantage of developing a CBE program like Andrew suggested. So I will, because I don't want to take too much time. I think it's important that when there is the site visit of the examinators or from the government, from the accreditation agencies, you thoroughly explain your CBE model, because there's not one model of competency-based education, that they need to understand what you're doing exactly. You have also to showcase your continuous quality improvement workflow, so that they understand that you are improving all the time. This is also very important during the site visit. And you should use the site visitors as your allies to push towards your institution to fulfill some needs that you may have in terms of budget, in terms of special regulations or student progression that is different in CBE than in other programs. And I think the next slide is, yeah, that's it. So thank you very much. I hope this was useful, but of course you will find much more details into the written chapter, and I hope this will be helpful for you to develop a good program and make sure it stays relevant and accurate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Take-home message is implementation, but how do you make sure that it remains relevant with quality assurance parameters in place? Thanks a million for that. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sean Gleason from the United States. Sean is the Assistant Dean for Distance Degrees and Programs at the University of Colorado Skaggs School of Pharmacy in the US, and she's also the Associate Professor of Clinical Pharmacy. At FIP, Sean is also a Global Lead for Academic Capacity, DG1, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the floor, Sean, to provide us with some of your insights and your contributions to the handbook. Welcome.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dahlia. And as Claire Anderson, I saw just noted, it is Thanksgiving in the US. And so I will just take this opportunity to say how thankful I am for the opportunity and for all the teammates that contributed to this chapter or to this handbook, and to all of you for helping to embrace competency-based education to advance our profession. I'm also very thankful for my partner in this chapter, Kirsty Galbraith from Monash University in Australia. So let's move on and talk about the chapter. And I guess the other thing I want to say is our chapter really served as an overview to training. So I'm hoping that with the chapter, the citations, as well as this session, you can use that as a starting point for your topics. And so if we really start diving into what are some of the first needs of faculty training, and we saw how important it is, sometimes the first challenge is embracing that this is a change for everyone. And sometimes I think we all know change is not easy. So the first step might be sharing the rationale for that change. And Naoko covered some of the background of the calls for change from the WHO and others, asking that we really make sure that our profession is prepared for the rapidly changing needs of the healthcare environment. So that's really the main background. I also wanted to share this article that was put out by Denise Roney and colleagues in the US that provides some really recent rationale for the change to competency-based education. And in it, they provide an acronym, ASTEP, that shows drivers that are related to academic, social, technologic, economic, and political needs that are driving us toward a change to competency-based education. So when we get to that, some examples of why we can share that competency-based education is needed, we might want to first, talk about the academic needs. I think after COVID, and this is a large part of what this article covers, is there's some faculty burnout. And that's with the traditional model of time-based education, lecture-based, and so many different times that we have to be there. And competency-based education allows us to really step back and make it more individualized and more about the learner, and taking some of that pressure off of us. So that's one reason. Also, getting right to the very crux of what Naoko mentioned at the beginning are the social drivers. Competency-based education really allows us to be nimble and address those changing professional responsibilities that our profession has. And then I won't go through all of them, but I do think an important one that we all learned from the COVID experience was how technology has played into our education and has taught us that, you know, flexible learning is possible. And that's a key part of competency-basted education, is to be flexible with the needs of our learners. So you can read more about it. And I invite you to check out that article, because it does provide some nice background to that. Next slide, please. So once that rationale for competency-based education is covered, let's move on to some of our suggested topics for training within your faculty or experiential colleagues. As we've learned throughout this session, competency-based education is honestly somewhat of a complex theory. So step one, if it's needed within your faculty, is really assure that the foundations of education are sound. And as we know, the academic section put out a wonderful framework for this by Ariana Mostrovich and colleagues on the Global Competency Framework for Educators and Trainers. So this provides a good set of competencies on which to assure that your faculty have understanding. And so you can see some of the different clusters or topics that are covered within it. The other thing we've learned today is that, honestly, and this is covered very well in the literature, there is some confusion among the many educational terms. So really just starting with those fundamental definitions of competency-based education versus outcomes-based education, for example. It's covered very well in chapter 2 of this handbook. Other terms such as milestones, frameworks, entrustable professional activities we learned about. All of that are really some key foundation settings that can help in establishing your training program. Next slide, please. So from there, it's important that we just dive into the key principles of competency-based education. To start with, we learned about the needs-based education model that's provided in chapter 2. So that really establishes the need. But from there, looking at the key principles of competency-based education, our colleague who is right here on the call with us, moderating it, Dr. Dalia Bajas and her colleagues provided a really nice model of competency-based education that really covers it all, and I would say could serve as a good starting point for a training program. Some key concepts within it is that competency-based education is person-centered, learner-centered. And this is in contrast to our traditional teacher-centered model of giving a lecture. So that is a key point to really start with your faculty and colleagues on, is making that switch. Like our traditional methods, it does also have a progression of abilities. And the key point within those are a couple of things. Number one, everything is context-based, providing either the workplace or a simulated context within earlier curricular activities. And then next, practice will be so important as you're diving into competency-based education. So assuring that your faculty understand that concept of formative assessments and then summative assessments or milestones that serve as the markers to progressing to the next level. With all of that practice, it's essential that our faculty members are skilled in the art of feedback, and we'll go into that in a little bit more and in a next slide down. But also then the other part of, I can talk without this, the other part of the competency-based education is to understand that this is a lifelong learning model. So anytime our students have acquired some competencies, they might move on, say, for example, throughout their career, and identify that maybe they have some other learning needs. And so all of our competencies will inform where we're going from there in tandem with what our needs are. So I invite you to use that model as a good starting point. Within it, we talked about the importance of education being context-based. And a lot of this really started in the workplace environment. And there's some wonderful work done in the Australian arena on workplace-based assessments, which my understanding are very close to entrustable professional activities. And some of the training that's important within them is to make sure that our preceptors or clinical partners are familiar with the tasks that are being asked of our students, that they're trained in the art of feedback, and also that they understand that competency-based education is about the individualization to each of our students' needs. Earlier in the curriculum, we can cover that with some simulated models such as case-based discussions, simulations in clinical settings, standardized patients, et cetera. And you can read more about that in the chapter and on this slide. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, a key part of competency-based education, which will honestly be a change for many of us educators, is the importance of feedback. We're all very skilled at giving presentations, but sometimes giving that individualized feedback might be a little bit more difficult for us. So there are some wonderful articles out there, and they're cited in the chapter on really where feedback comes into play. First of all, identifying goals, either at the larger level or the individual level. And then really, this is where the challenge comes in, is becoming skilled in the ability to observe our students and to identify their strengths, identify where they may need improvement, and then providing that individualized feedback. And with that, communication might be a real important training topic for our colleagues. This can happen in the workplace setting, as I've shown here on the right, or even in earlier curricular settings, as depicted here in our interprofessional education course. Next slide, please. A key part of our workplace-based assessment is our partnership with our preceptors or clinical partners. Now, they've been doing this for a long time in many parts of the world, but we cannot always assume that they have the requisite knowledge and skills to take on competency-based education. So some fine work has been done within Australia, and colleagues there working to identify what are the competencies needed of our clinical colleagues. And so you can see some citations there. And with that, they've been trying to identify what the minimum standards are, so they can move on to the more advanced standards. Next slide, please. That going from minimum to advanced level is really right in line with what FIP has been providing at the professional level here with our global competency frameworks. So next slide, please. I'm looking at my time here, and you can click Marwan through. I think there are some other, two more. So when we look at preceptor development, I invite you all to go to the Australian Pharmacy Council website depicted here. These videos that you see are really wonderful explanations of what these workplace-based assessments can look like. Next slide, please. And so then finally, when it comes back to implementing a training program, I would suggest that a good place to start is really looking at the systems-based approach. What are the professional competency frameworks we have either provided to us by FIP or many of our national accreditation standards and other frameworks? These are designed to meet the needs of the profession, the society, and ultimately the learner. As far as who can deliver, how to deliver this training, much like competency-based education itself, we are educating or training adult learners. So the social constructivist theory or context-based education is so important. It can be provided in a number of ways, whether that's in a live setting or an online setting. And then when we get to who delivers this, because it is a new concept, oftentimes we're getting to the level of peer-to-peer education. And sometimes that is the best anyway. So identifying those faculty champions, maybe skills consultants who are expert in particular competencies, and expert preceptors. If you're fortunate enough to have an education department in your school, an instructional design team, lean on them, as is covered in chapter 4, our curriculum committees and so on. Naturally, there will be challenges, so I invite you to assess the outcomes of your own learners to share, hopefully, that they're succeeding. There are also many examples within the literature. And then others, it will be a change. It's an initial workload challenge. So I would suggest that starting on your training program and implementation maybe as pilots, portions of your curriculum, and so on. And then finally, not only should we be evaluating our overall competency-based education program as discussed in Chapter 5, but also our training program, identify where future needs are needed. And so with that, I will pass it back to Marwan. Or is it Dahlia? I'm not sure. So
both of us, thank you, Sean, for this wonderful presentation, and happy Thanksgiving. So thank you for being part of the team, and thank you everyone for this presentation and this work. Allow me to invite you all to open your cameras and to have a virtual panel discussion. We will be answering some of the questions that we had on the Q&A chat box. Dalia and myself will be moderating this session. And allow me to start by a question that just came to my mind after listening to all of these presentations, because we've heard many times the word challenges, and we don't want to have an impact. So we don't want them to just keep the idea of the challenge in mind. So I will ask a question that is a bit weird. I would say, we have challenges for competency-based education, but I want you please to fill in the blank after this but, to talk about all what we can get from implementing a competency-based education. Allow me to start with Naoko. So what would be after this but word? So even though we have challenges, but what will get in return?
So I think the challenges, depending on the the situations of the people trying to implement the CBE. So I think some of you may want to go to the handbook and see you probably identify where you are, and then going through some of the steps written in the handbook as well. But also as a FIP, probably the next step for us to support the further would be the using this handbook and how we're going to support and develop the the CBE champions in the schools, those kind of things. I think these kind of things would be further that we can consider as a FIP. But for now, I think we would love to hear any opinions or suggestions from the users of the handbook, how they use and then how they want us to support.
Thank you, Naoko. Anyone else want to add anything about? Yeah, go ahead, Pierre, please.
Yeah, so but you will get transformed graduates for implementing 2 programs now and working on a 3rd one. The confidence that the graduates have is not comparable. I mean, when you have this knowledge-based type of education, encyclopedia walking in the pharmacy, but they don't know how to apply this knowledge. So they don't feel confident. They feel they have to wait for people. They're not proactive. They're not leading anything. But when you empower them to be competent in providing specific professional activities, they know they did it. They know they can do it. They become completely, more autonomous, confident. I saw a huge difference, and it takes, to be honest with you, here in Kuwait, for instance, we take 5th-year students that have been spoon-fed for 5 years, and we do a 2-year add-on PharmD, which is competency-based. After 1 month, then they start to understand, and after 2 months, they say, now I feel like I'm a pharmacist. And they already had 5 years of education before, but they don't know what to do with this knowledge. So for me, competency-based education creates these transformed professionals that I'm sure will make a bigger impact on the healthcare system. So that's the but for me.
Thank you. Any additions, or we can go to another? Yeah, go ahead, Andres.
I think I can only confirm that it's also extremely satisfying for the teachers to see the growth of students in the whole curriculum. And when I compare that, the old and the new system, our students are much more independent, much more motivated, much more engaging. They are much more up to challenges and even starting new programs, etc. And you see sometimes students develop in 1 or 2 years the capabilities which in an old system you see only after 5 or 6 years. So also for a teacher, it's very satisfying if you look at the growth of individual students. It's not about doing your own lectures. It's about other people changing in the way they could be useful for their society.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, it gives us the flexibility to address all of those rapid changes that come about us. And we all saw that recently with COVID, where the profession had to rapidly change to the ability of giving vaccinations. And so competency-based education allows us to be nimble and say, okay, here's a new competency we need to learn, let's implement it. And from the confidence previously, the students can do it.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone. Dalia?
Thanks, Marwan. I think I'll also try and address some of the questions that have been posed by our audience here for our panel. And I think there's a question here that I might pass on to perhaps Narco, because you indicated that you could address this particular one, Narco. And this is coming from a colleague who is asking about whether the competency framework in pharmacy education could perhaps be applicable in a low-income country where the practice of pharmacy is relatively weak in the area of clinical pharmacy services. So I wondered if you wanted to provide a comment on the relevance and the applicability of CBE whilst people might be struggling with the scope of practice and the availability of different services. Thanks,
yes, thank you, Daria. So I think there's several questions that we have in the questions and the answer box, and it was more related to the relevance, which was explored as the discussion by Pierre in his talk as well. But also I think from my side, I introduced some of the competency framework that FIP has. That is a global competency framework, and probably the people and the audience in this session might feel like, okay, can we really use that? Because that might not be relevant to our countries or our settings. So I think Pierre commented in some of the answers already saying that needs assessment is necessary. I would say that localizations of the competency framework is necessary as well. I think that is why the global competency framework is really beneficial, because you don't have to start by scratch. I think that will give you the foundation where you can start working on it, and then you can localize it to adjust in your local settings, and then just to make sure the competency framework is just for not only for present setting, but also that gives your future vision of your pharmacy profession of the country. So it doesn't have to be only for current present pharmacy status, but you can give some like the future vision of the pharmacy profession through the competency framework, so that the current student can adjust and adapt to the changing worlds for the future, so that they don't have to stuck in the present. I think these some of the questions that are quite related to it. Some of them feel like, okay, we are not really advanced enough to use the competency framework, but this is the way that you can start and localize it. And that in our team and the FIP, we nationalize the competency framework from the FIP framework. For example, Jess did the right one for Kenya, but also we have the other people doing in Saudi Arabia or any other countries. And then also later on, I think in the 2023, that DG2 team, the early career training team will give you the case study report as well. So I think that will give you some idea how we're going to develop the nationalized competency framework based on the global framework.
Thanks, Marco. I think that you've really addressed that quite well, particularly for those perhaps that are thinking or fearing the idea of CBE, where there is that disparity between education and practice. And so simply put, people might be thinking, I'm going to be investing in perhaps, teaching our students a particular set of competencies, but when they go out into practice, these services are not even available. So why would I even bother with that? And this goes back to this point of, is it education or practice services first? And I think that they're actually interlinked. And that you could do them in parallel. So whilst you might be a little bit fearful of the idea, I think one way of looking at this or rethinking CBE is that it's actually an element of empowerment for students and future pharmacists, that whilst the services might not be there yet, them being empowered with these competencies going into the workforce will definitely start a bit of an evolution, if not a revolution, in your pharmacy practice in your particular areas. And I think Pierre touched on this earlier from his own experience in working in different countries, that this does have a bit of a ripple effect, if you like, when these students go back into practice. So thanks for that, Narako. And I think as well, having Jess on the call, who has done a lot of work in the research area, I also wondered, Jess, whether you wanted to provide a comment about, the different features of CBE and how people could really leverage the knowledge that we have in the literature to empower ourselves with that knowledge, to be able to implement what we've instigated in the handbook. What would be your recommendation, perhaps, to those that are thinking about it?
So for the features, I would say the most important thing to think about is the collaboration. So between the team in your school, but also wider as well, because from the research, there is a lot of success when schools share the developments, because a lot of the elements are the same. So you can contextualize to pharmacy or medicine or even law, but the base concept is the same. So sharing within your school and then also sharing across your school has been really helpful, and also across countries. So the main thing as well is to get that wider involvement, because the point of CBE is to produce the pharmacist that can do their job in their setting. And that means we need to ensure that the curriculum is actually providing the intended learning and not something else. So it may be that your program is designed to have a certain outcome, but the evaluation after you have made your implementation is really important to see, is our curriculum, is the CBE approach actually achieving the intended outcome as well.
Thanks, Tess. And when you talk collaboration, to clarify, we're talking about the educator, the practitioner, the regulator, the pharmacist, all of those people, all the stakeholders being involved in this particular implementation.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Marwan, there's a question, I can see a thread there in the Q&A about how do we evaluate CBE, and I think this can go to Andres, Sean, and Pierre. They all touched on this. Pierre, you provided some examples. Sean, you spoke about it, and Andres, you mentioned this in chapter 4. So, what would be your message to our listeners here who are asking about this particular point? How do we evaluate CBE?
Can I say something about it? Of
Thanks,
course,
Andres.
I think the evaluation, it's not only external evaluation. What's most important, in particular, if you are starting with a new program, is do it in-house and do it very frequently on a very low level. And also, how would you evaluate? Well, what are the important elements? There's not so much published about what are the elements of the competency-based education, which could be evaluated, but we are, as a team, we also are preparing a kind of publication about it, but it will take about half a year to try to describe that, because it also, of course, is a first instance of doing that. But I think evaluation can be done on all levels. It could be started on a course level, it could be on a curriculum level, when annual evaluation. Sometimes you have to overhaul some courses after 3-4 years, etc. So it needs to be an awareness in the organization of getting feedback, what's going wrong, what goes, and talk to your students and your teachers. That's the most important thing if you are involved in management of a curriculum or a curriculum change, I think.
Yeah, I fully agree with Andres. I mean, definitely communication is key, especially when you start implementing, for instance, a new year of a new curriculum. You can't wait at the end of the year to see if things went well. So there is assessment along the way. You have to sit with your students. I know in Montreal, when we implemented the new curriculum, which is competency-based in 2007, it was a new experiment for us and for the students. So we had this, we asked the student to create a kind of a committee with representative from each course, and we would meet with them every 2 weeks to see how things are going, what can we improve, what is going well, what is not going well, and so on and so forth. So without having, too much bureaucracy and paper and reports, just getting the pulse. And so and the same with our academic staff as well. So what Andres said is key: communication. So take, it doesn't have to be always, very extensive surveys or, very detailed research. Just talk and listen and see how things are going and adapt as you go, because some of these approaches are new and we want to do it the best we can, but sometimes, they're not done ideally, or the students don't understand where it's going. So communication is key, definitely. All forms of communication.
Yeah, and as far as evaluation of the training, it really mirrors everything that was just said. This was covered a little bit in an article in our citation list about preceptor training. And what they suggested is, first of all, talk to the students or assess the students, find out their confidence level, getting to Pierre's earlier point. Also some, peer-to-peer assessment, and honestly, self-assessment, asking the academic or the preceptor, how do they think they're doing? What do they still need training on?
Thank you so much for the insight. I have one final question before we wrap up the session, and that is, how applicable are the concepts in the handbook to other settings, including continuing professional development, CPD? Can we apply some of the CBE concepts that we outline in the handbook to develop continuing professional development for pharmacists? Nako?
Yeah, I would like to start that, I think if the CBE is the great model to see the seamless transitions from the initial education to the postgraduate. So I think first of all, I'd like to feature that to think about lifelong learning, because I think that we have to consider relevance in the practice and thinking about the future. So that gives the lifelong learning skills that we have to instill that, the students to do that. But also if we start using the foundation level competency frameworks to develop the competency-based education in initial education, so that will give the same competency framework for the different levels, which gives the continuity from the initial education to the foundation level and then further. So I think that will give the great guidance and navigations for any learners to coming from the initial education to the foundation level. which gives that a seamless transition, which often the pharmacy graduates have issues and challenges when they come into the practice.
Thank you, Naoko. Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Pierre.
Just quickly, I mean, there's no boundaries for when CBE can be used or should not be. And I think even in continuous professional development, we did more CBE before. Most of these courses are hands-on, or to learn to practice doing medrec or other types of professional activities. So I think in the past, CPD was more CBE based than the initial curriculum. But there's no boundaries. We can adapt and use the same approach. It's like a model. You can use it for pharmacy, for medicine, for other disciplines, but you can also use it for initial education or advanced education. So I don't see any boundaries where it's limited. It's actually an approach that is, and the closer you are to practice or with practitioners, it's even, I think, more important to have a competency-based education approach rather than just providing knowledge and expecting outcomes that are practice outcomes.
Thank you, everyone. We're bound to time. We have to wrap up our webinar. This was really a wonderful webinar for a launch of another very helpful handbook or publication from FIP that we will be adding to our other publications. Please go ahead, use it. Ask us if you want anything. Start implementing and come back to us. This handbook is here to be used, and this is only the start of other steps or other levels in our project. The interaction from the audience was wonderful. We're having the celebration, marks, the hearts, the celebrations, and the claps all over the screen. Thank you, everyone. We are as excited as you to launch this handbook. Thank you for all the speakers and the authors that were involved, and see you soon on other events. Thank you, everyone. Wishing you all a nice continuation of the day or a nice night. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.